Hi, I'm James Andrews. I'm here at IAFP 2013. I've got Dr. David Acheson with me, former Chief Medical Officer at FDA and USDA's FSIS, and he was our keynote speaker here. And you came, and you're currently at Labor Partners too. I should mention that. You came, you impressed everyone with the keynote. What else are you doing here? What more do you have to prove?
Well, I hope I don't have to prove anything, but this is just a great forum for meeting folk, and come here, and there are people who I live down the street from almost in Washington, and I don't see them year by year other than at IAFP. So it's good to see what's new, what's current, hot on science, hot on regulatory, meet, catch up, and all of that. So and besides which, you might even hook a few clients while I'm here too. So that's what it's about.
So the thesis of your keynote was essentially, right now, a lot of change in the food safety industry since going back to about '93 or so has been inspired by what you call disasters, or really deadly outbreaks. Yeah. And you proposed a sort of paradigm shift from having change be inspired by these disasters to inspiring change through planning. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, we all joke, and it's not a joke, it's a sick joke, that what drives change in the food safety space is bodies in the street. We're all here at a meeting like this because we're food safety aficionados one way or another. We're either passionate about it, or we're scientists, we're regulatory folk. And we've all seen that what drives change is disaster. And it's at multiple levels. The worst case is when we actually have people die and get sick. And you're right, Jack in the Box '93 was a huge driver, and there's been several since. Other disasters are just within companies. They narrowly squeak going out of business because something has gone wrong. And maybe they've made people sick, or there's even been some deaths. But there's paradigm shifts within a company. And many say that a company is either driven because they have just had a recall, or they will have a recall. It's like you're not in the it's never going to happen to me mode if you're being realistic. So the challenge is, how do you get folk who are working with narrow margins, many moving parts, looking for low cost, high productivity, meeting consumer requirements, to say we need to plan for something that is just a cost center. There's no ROI on food safety. Product design, new product, new innovation, up the sales, marketing gets excited. Along comes the VP of food safety and says, I need $100,000 to fix a problem. And it's like, well, what's the return on that? And the sell of, well, here's what's going to happen if you don't do it, is kind of hollow. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm dreaming, maybe it's utopia, but I think it's, as an industry, we need to try to move in that direction. It's essentially what it's about.
You said on Sunday, we were talking about consumer perceptions, specifically about new science and new technology, and in the battle of ideas, science doesn't always win when it comes to the marketplace. Right. Another concept you brought forward was being open-minded to technology. Right. Specifically irradiation, nanotechnology, things like that. I was hoping you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the first point you make is probably the most important message. And that is recognizing that everyone who touches the food, from the point at which it's planted in the ground as a seed or as an animal or however it starts out, to the point at which you put it in your mouth, has got some role to play in keeping it safe. And the consumer rightly expects the food that they pick up to have been treated appropriately from the point of its origin to the point at which they purchase it. But an expectation that the food will inevitably be pathogen-free it just isn't reality. So where I was going with that is understanding that raw poultry, raw fish, raw seafood, etc., ground beef is going to have some level of bugs on it. So learn and handle it accordingly. With regard to the technology question, it was more about, and this is purely approaching it from a science perspective. If you look at something like irradiation, especially something like an E-beam, which is just high energy electricity. And you generate E-beams by putting your machine into a wall socket, essentially. It's what it is. And it will kill bugs. There's lots of science to support that. It has minimal impact on the quality of the product, minimal impact on vitamins. Yeah, a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, it's minimal. There's lots of studies to show that we're not generating dangerous chemicals and dangerous radicals. And it can be absolutely used to reduce microbes. Now, I'm a firm believer in consumers having information and having choice. I'm also well aware that almost a quarter of our population by 2025 is going to be immune compromised. And I'm getting older. I'm going to become increasingly immune compromised. I would like to have the option to continue to love and enjoy spinach. I'm going to face a point in my life when I'm saying, all right, David, you're 80 years old. Hopefully I live that long. I'm immune compromised. Dare I eat the spinach? And I would like to have a choice to say, I'm going to buy spinach that's been treated by something that isn't going to mess with its quality, it isn't going to mess with its taste or its flavor, but it's going to have killed microbes on it. And I'm not saying we need to embrace irradiation. Frankly, I think that day's past. I think getting consumers to accept that is going to be a heavy lift. But my message is that there'll be another technology that comes along that will be just as effective, and maybe a little less scary in a consumer's eyes, and be open-minded in terms of that it actually could help. And it may be that's a product that you would want to feed your grandma or your grandpa, or your immune-compromised child, or whatever. It's just wanting consumers to be willing to have an open mind around technologies that could save a life.
You also discussed the need to improve research capabilities on studies of long-term exposure to chemicals. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges and some examples of kinds of chemicals that we might be interested in studying.
Sure, absolutely. Let's draw the analogy of where we are today with microbes. We know full well that if you consume a certain amount of Salmonella or E. coli 0157, we know what's likely to happen to you. And it's going to happen within 24, 48, 72 hours, maybe a week. But it's going to happen pretty quick. So the cause and effect is short. And it's clear and it's obvious and it's easy for us to figure it out, which is probably why we're so much further ahead of the curve of understanding microbial risk than we are chemical risk. We also know that if you get exposed to really high levels of arsenic, you're going to have an acute problem and you could die. What the challenge is what is the human health impact of lower levels of some of these heavy metals and other compounds that are just naturally present in the environment? A couple of examples. Lead is one where we know a lot about. Lead has been studied for years. We know pretty much what a tolerable daily intake is. And basically that means is what level can I consume my whole life and not worry. And we got a good handle on that. We got a fairly good handle on arsenic. You get into some things like cadmium, other heavy metals. We know quite a lot about mercury. We get into pesticides. Let me come back to pesticides, but let's take cadmium. Cadmium is something that is getting increased prominence. We know that in animal studies it causes kidney failure, it can cause cancer. But just how much cadmium is safe? You look at what the Europeans have done, and it's almost like a tenfold difference in terms of what's considered to be an okay level to consume. Okay, we ratcheted up another level of complexity. There's quite a lot of data around pesticides and other environmental chemicals where, in order to get them approved, we have to understand the risk. A big challenge is if you take 3 or 4 pesticides and you know that I can expose to a certain amount of each one of them for a lifetime and I'm going to be okay. What we don't know is what happens if I'm exposed to all 3 of them at that low level. Do they add up? Is there, worst case, synergy? So a little bit of this and a little bit of that creates a lot of something else. So that is a really complex thing to unravel. And you know, the talk that I gave is a perfect platform to throw out really complicated challenges to people without having to have any answers.
So we're talking a lot about the future. Maybe a topic that's a little closer to the present is the politics of food safety and some of the interagency power struggles we see, or tug of war type stuff. And one buzzword you had that you used repeatedly during your keynote was catfish. I was wondering if you could talk about how, for those who don't know, in the Farm Bill there was this whole issue about, like a new $20 million agency to monitor catfish through the USDA, whereas fish is normally monitored through the FDA. How does that kind of help illustrate some of the problems we have with food safety regulation right now?
That's a great question, and it's one that I think is very illustrative of some of the challenges. The whole catfish issue began, I believe, and this is somewhat of my speculation, that there were catfish farmers in the United States who were looking at where their business was going in relation to imported catfish from Asia. And they were losing market share. And that hits business. It hits small business, and it's, from a marketing, business, survival perspective, it's not insignificant. It's got to be managed. So the strategy that was adopted was to say, at least again, is the way I think this went, was the politics in food safety said one of the things that will give imported catfish manufacturers and growers a real headache is to make them regulated by USDA. It gives them a headache because FDA has a much more stringent way of regulating than FDA. The continuous inspection notion, the standards, the fact that the comparability, the equivalence, it requires rulemaking, and it's long-winded. So, okay, you put this particular commodity under that regulatory control, it's going to effectively shut them down for a few years, if not permanently. It's a much heavier lift. Now, okay, I understand the politics behind that, but what blew me away was that the argument for moving this particular commodity was because it was high risk. That's where I lost it, because I mean, so catfish high risk. I've been in food safety for 30 plus years. I don't remember the last catfish related outbreak. So you go do your research, and there isn't been one. There's an odd little anecdote someplace that maybe somebody got sick one day from catfish, but it could have been the sprouts. There's just nothing there to support it. So the quote science that was being used to drive this decision, I think, was misguided. And what ended up, to your point, was that it went into the Farm Bill, it passed in the Farm Bill, and FDA has always had seafood, all seafood, and they still have all seafood except catfish. Everything else that's seafood is with FDA. Catfish was moved to USDA, who do not have a clue about seafood or catfish, and they had to ramp up. And the estimated cost for USDA to ramp up to do this was $30 million.
I was off by $10 million.
You were off by $10 million.
I was giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, the numbers I saw were $30 million, and I lost it a second time. And this was in an environment 2008, 2009, 2010. It was a time where our economy was not doing too good, and it was a time when the administration, Bush and then Obama, was saying we've got to cut funding to food safety, and I'm looking at things that matter. We talked about chemicals. We talked about microbes. They matter. People die from that stuff. People are not dying from catfish. And it really bothered me that $30 million of a very precious resource was being squandered, in my opinion, on ramping up an agency that was not into seafood to be able to do seafood. And there's been multiple attempts to reverse that decision, and it's still not being reversed. But it just sort of speaks to politics messing with food safety. And not that I don't sympathize with catfish farmers in the U.S. who are losing business too, but that's the reality of business.
What about the idea of a single food safety agency at the federal level?
Oh, I love that idea. But once again, it's an impractical notion for a keynote speech on a Sunday evening. I've always been an advocate of a single food safety agency for a variety of reasons. I think It would force us to simplify the statutes. It would force us to base regulatory strategy truly on risk. I worked at both FSIS and I worked at FDA. When I was at FSIS, we worried about around about 7,000 facilities. We had about 7,000 inspectors, and we had a budget of just under $1 billion. I moved to FDA. We didn't have 7,000 facilities. We had about 450,000 facilities. We didn't have 7,000 inspectors. We had about 2,000. We didn't have $1 billion. We had about 750 million. Go figure. It just doesn't add up. And this needs to be figured out through changes in statutes. The whole philosophy needs to be adjusted. I think the other challenge to this is if it's done right, there's going to be a lot of legal change, but it has to be done right with appropriate funding. You cannot simply take two entities and throw them in the same pot and hope that things will work. And again, I was working in the government when DHS was created, and that was not optimal times. It didn't go as well as I think people hoped, and it's still a challenge. And that we need to learn from that to some extent. Well, we need to learn from it to a great deal extent. So it needs to be adequately funded, it needs to be thought through, appropriate statutes, but ultimately it's the way that we should be headed.
Dr. Acheson, I really appreciate you speaking with me for a few minutes. It's been a pleasure. All right, thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.